It is not possible to talk about media coverage of criminal justice without talking about race. The history of law enforcement in America has roots in the post-Civil War Reconstruction. Systemic racism persists in almost every element of the criminal justice system, and whether we like to admit it or not, it lingers in our media infrastructure. Despite renewed efforts to improve representation in our newsrooms, especially at leadership levels, more work remains. Our next speaker is a civil rights leader, mother, and professional and spiritual support to countless activists across Louisiana and beyond. She is also the first Black woman to lead the ACLU of Louisiana in its 66-year history. Please join me in welcoming to the stage the Executive Director of the ACLU of Louisiana, Alanah Odoms.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Nice to see you all. Welcome to New Orleans during carnival season. How many people here are from New Orleans? All right. So have you briefed everybody about the season that they are experiencing here? Have you had a chance to share with people? How many people are staying a little beyond the conference? Beautiful. I'm going to catch you up on the parades and local places you need to hit up and make sure that you have the proper New Orleans experience. Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. My name is Alanah Odoms. I'm the Executive Director of the ACLU of Louisiana. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with the ACLU at the national level. We have 54 affiliates all over the United States, and I am really privileged to be able to lead, I think, one of the most groundbreaking affiliates in the nation. We are one of the smallest. We're very small but mighty. But I think the reason why our work is so powerful is because we connect the history, primarily the very, I think, complex and rich history of this place, Louisiana, which is one of the most incarcerated places in the entire universe by virtue of being the per capita incarcerator, top incarcerator in the United States, with the history of slavery in this country. And so what I am going to suggest to you today, which is something that I think you probably already know, but in order to be conscious about reporting about crime, you have to have a racial lens. And I think that's what makes us special at the ACLU of Louisiana. We apply a racial justice lens to all of our work, and that has really guided the decisions that we've made around the pillar core issues that we focus on. Criminal legal reform is one of those issues, and police accountability is another. And those are some of the areas that we're going to talk about this afternoon. So race-conscious reporting. So I'm a parent. How many parents do we have in the room? Caretakers of young people. A few years ago, there was a groundbreaking book written, and it was called Conscious Parenting. And Dr. Shefali Sabari, she was on Oprah, and she shared some of the most, I think, groundbreaking information I'd ever heard about parenting. And really what it did is it kind of upended some of the deep assumptions that go along with parenting. And essentially what she says is that most parents think of themselves as incredibly selfless people dedicated to the care and uplifting of young people and just service and just love and all those things. I thought of myself in this way too very much. By the way, I have a 9-year-old little girl. But what she said parenting actually is it's actually one of the most selfish things that we do, because we actually want to create a human being that looks like us, thinks like us, usually may even end up working or being in the same line of work as us. And if they don't do those things, we pressure them and we make them feel bad and we do all of these kinds of things. And so really, I thought about this, I'm like, okay, so she called this whole idea conscious parenting, of decentering ourselves as parents and really centering and focusing on young people. And I thought, gosh, that's really interesting. Conscious parenting. I'm like, well, is there a way for me to be a conscious lawyer? Right? Can we bring this idea of consciousness to our own professions and practices? So when I think about conscious lawyering, I think about decentering what the ideas of traditional lawyering might be, and I think about centering the client, right? Making sure that we're providing the best possible representation we can to the client, and sometimes that might diverge from what a lawyer might actually want, but it's actually really focused on the needs of the individual. In the same way, when I think about reporting, particularly when I think about crime and reporting, I think we have to have that race-conscious lens. So constantly being conscious that we're not just reflecting a system that has a certain set of statistics or a certain demographic or a certain ideology. We're actually having to combat an ideology that is inherently one that presents itself in a way that is particularly harmful for marginalized communities, including not just African American people, is particularly harmful to the ideas for young people, particularly harmful to women, particularly harmful to other identities that don't conform with our status quo, the LGBTQ plus community. And so really kind of thinking about a holistic approach to reporting, wherein we not just acknowledge, but we also articulate the fact that the criminal legal system is inherently biased against people of color, the poor, and these other identities that I spoke about. Of the top 10 most incarcerated states in the United States, were you aware that those are the former states of the Confederacy? Top 10 states. Most of them are in the American South. It would make sense because largely what we did when we ended slavery is we needed to create a system of incarceration that would largely provide the kind of labor that incarcerated people provided during slavery. And so, you know, if you're doing reporting about crime in any of the most incarcerated places in the country, it's really incumbent upon you to have this race-conscious reporting lens. And also, obviously, anywhere else in the country, because, you know, we tend to think of the South as, you know, really backward and, you know, they just don't get it, and, you know, racism is so much more overt here. But in reality, the United States, of course, is also the most incarcerated country in the world, and of course the South leads in incarceration, but we have an epidemic of incarceration across the United States. So crime reporting is largely racially discriminatory because it focuses on individual incidents mostly, of violent crime typically, and it typically does not include any critical analysis of the criminal legal system. We had an opportunity to work with a journalist that it was a really exciting and really wonderful opportunity, but ProPublica sent Richard Webster, a journalist here, a couple of years ago, and he stayed for an entire year and did a series of reports on the Jefferson Parish Sheriff's Office, which I'll kind of talk to you a little bit about later on. But JPSO is one of the most, I guess, notorious abusers in the state of Louisiana as it relates to people of color. And one of the things that I thought was so interesting about this particular story that he did, and it really gets to this idea of data and what data can help us understand, is a lot of times, well, first of all, in the criminal legal system and police agencies, period, are not typically they're not too inclined to turn over data around misconduct, data around discriminatory practices. That's, you know, not something that's usually readily available. But this particular article really showed that the Jefferson Parish Sheriff's Office, in order to show, or in order to essentially cover up that they had been targeting particularly Hispanic drivers, they were essentially just, in their citations, just including everyone as white. And so what that does, though, obviously, is, you know, a lot of times, you know, we're an advocacy organization, so we're always screaming from the rooftops that, oh, gosh, there's so much discrimination, there's so much harm, there's so much going on. And it's like, well, okay, well, show me the proof. Well, you know, look at a parish like Jefferson Parish, and, you know, you look at, you know, you pull the records and you say, okay, well, how are you actually conducting, you know, your stops? And you look and it appears that there's no discrimination there. It's simply, you know, what is? And then you kind of go in a little bit further and you see. And so this is the kind of like investigative reporting that I think can be so powerful, but really what it's about is challenging the status quo. I mean, essentially it's about challenging police, which is a very difficult thing to do, but it is about challenging status quo, and it's about recognizing that there are probably a million different ways that are baked into the system that tend to be discriminatory, and really kind of looking a little bit deeper than what's presented to kind of find where those areas are. So we actually did some of this kind of dig deep kind of analysis ourselves at the ACLU of Louisiana a few years ago. So we did a lot of research. We wanted to really understand the front end of incarceration a little bit better. So about 5.5 years ago, the state went through a really amazing kind of transformative process called justice reinvestment. And really that studied kind of the back end of the system. Once people are incarcerated, what are their sentences like? How are they serving time in community supervision? And what are their kind of pathways back after they've been incarcerated? And from that package of legislative reform, we were actually able to release several thousand people early, save the state a bunch of money. The ACLU was involved in that practice. But what we didn't look at was pretrial incarceration. And pretrial incarceration happens to be a really detrimental, really harmful, and really dangerous aspect of the criminal legal system that's not much focused on. And it's actually an area of the criminal legal system that really, I think, could get a lot of support from the public, because people who are incarcerated pretrial are still, in the eyes of the law, let's all say it together, they are innocent. Yes, exactly. So with Louisiana having been the incarceration capital of the world and home to obviously a very extensive network of state prisons and state jails, we knew very little about who was being incarcerated pre-trial, for how long, and the reasons. And so we did a series of public records requests to 64 parishes, to the sheriff's offices. You can imagine how that went. They were not happy to hear from us, and they were not happy to respond to our public records requests. And you could also imagine the way that the data was turned over. Some of it was like on scratch pads, some of it was on, it was a hodgepodge, because there are a lot of rural parishes and they don't have a lot of resources. But this was our intent, this is what we wanted to kind of study, and so that's what we did. And here's what we found. Black boys and men aged 15 to 24 are 5 times more likely to be jailed following arrest than their white counterparts of the same age. We found that black Louisianians are more than twice as likely to be jailed following arrest than white Louisianians. So it's from about a 36% of our sample size. And this part was really interesting, and I know we're kind of seeing some funny stuff on there, but as you might imagine, excessive bail was at the root of the injustice in pretrial. So it was not a question of guilt or innocence. It was a question of money, whether or not you had the wealth. And so if you're looking at, and we did, so largely 57% of people incarcerated pretrial in Louisiana were there on a nonviolent offense. So this was a drug or a property crime where no person was affected, there was no victim, 57% of people. The median bail set on these offenses is $24,000, and the median income in Louisiana being $27,000. So I mean that a lot of times you're really literally talking about whether someone has the ability to pay bail as to whether or not they remain incarcerated. And there's some pretty interesting ramifications of that, as you might imagine. There was a report done by an organization called the Pretrial Justice Institute a few years ago, and the report was entitled 3 Days Count. And essentially what the report showed was that it only takes about 3 days of incarceration for someone to be disconnected from all of the pro-social things in society that help support people's long-term well-being. I don't know about you, but if I decided not to show up to the ACLU of Louisiana for the next 3 days, I might not lose my job, but things would certainly be a little bit more in question. If I decided not to pick up my daughter for the next 3 days from school, or decided not to pay my rent or my mortgage, and so on and so forth, you see where this is going. And so what we saw in our research, and what I know, actually I didn't share this earlier, but I am a former prosecutor right here in New Orleans. I actually started out my career as an assistant district attorney. So I spent time on the other side of this issue. And what I know to be true from my experience at the DA's office is that people jailed pretrial are more likely to plead guilty even when they are innocent, just so that they can be released, so that they don't lose their jobs, don't lose their children, don't lose their housing. Another very interesting piece about people who spend time in jail pre-trial. The average length of stay that we saw for people incarcerated in Louisiana was 5.5 months serving time pre-trial. That's for a couple of different reasons, and you'll have access to the report. The report's on our website. But district attorneys here have up to 120 days to charge someone. Yeah. It's a long time. We worked on some legislation to be able to reduce that time, but these are the back end pieces that really, I think if were more prevalent in terms of knowledge to the public, I think people would be really shocked by this. But also there's research, and it was in that pretrial justice report, that if you were incarcerated and you've spent time up to 5.5 months before you actually have your trial date, you are actually more likely to be convicted by a jury of your peers. So there's also some elements in the system that actually, there's a weightiness to it, that it's not just about the fact that you have lost your job and your home, and it is also the weight, the inertia of the system. The system has a very, very sticky, very, very heavy inertia. Once you are ensnared in it, it kind of just takes you down, and it's like a current, and you kind of move with the current. And I mean, and this is just a very simple fact. If you've got to get home to your kids, you've got to get home to your kids. If you've got to get home to family, you've got to get home to family. So unconstitutional policing is a major contributing factor to the injustice in the criminal legal system. I know you all have had some conversations about policing here this morning already. I'll tell you a little bit about our program and how it operates. So the Justice Lab was a program that we created back in 2020, shortly after the death of George Floyd. And we decided that we wanted to bring resources together from all over the country by way of private law firms offering pro bono legal support, all targeted on addressing unconstitutional policing in the state of Louisiana. One of the things that we identified is that Louisiana has the highest policed to resident ratio of any state in the country, which essentially, logically, should mean that we are also one of the safest places in the country. And of course, it is the exact opposite. We are one of the most unsafe places in the nation. And so that really drove us to this, this idea of essentially, what are the reasons that we are continuing to remain a place that is inherently very, very unsafe, and people feel unsafe, and it's reported that we're unsafe, but we're not really examining this very front end of the system. So if we're thinking about the criminal legal system as a continuum, the police obviously represent that front door to the property, right? Literally, maybe even the gate to the property. And so we really wanted to look at, especially with a federal court strategy, Section 1983, how we might look to hold some of our police agencies accountable for the vile misconduct against people in the state of Louisiana. And so what we did was we did a plaintiff call across the entire country, across the entire state. And we heard from thousands of people that said, I've had my rights violated by police. And the other part of our strategy, which I think is a little bit different, is, as you might imagine, if your family member or loved one has been killed by police, it's very easy to get representation. However, if you've been unlawfully stopped, searched, seized, or excessive force that's short of maiming or killing, not so easy to get representation, right? Because what are your damages? What's really happened to you? What have you lost, and what can we actually have the law redress? And so if you can't get representation, you are also not able to bring those cases. The other thing that we saw is we ended up taking 50 cases and bringing 50 cases with plaintiffs before the federal court in every jurisdiction in Louisiana. Of those 50 cases, 37 people had criminal charges brought against them based upon the interaction with the police that we were prosecuting the civil rights claim for. These charges are what we call pretextual charges. They are simple assault, simple battery of a police officer, resisting arrest, things of this nature. One important thing to know about the state of Louisiana, which is also another hurdle which prevents us from being able to vindicate people's civil and constitutional rights, is the statute of limitations. Louisiana has a 1-year statute of limitations for civil rights violations. So if you have an incident with the police wherein your rights are violated, let's say it's an excessive force case, you also have a criminal charge that you have to fight. You have to retain an attorney to do that. It's very shocking, but many criminal defense attorneys don't also do civil rights work, and so they are not aware to give people this notice that they have 1 year to file those civil rights cases. And so you can clearly see there are a lot of factors that are weighing in on whether someone is actually able to bring a case in federal court to vindicate their constitutional rights. So that is why we did the Justice Lab. We wanted to be able to kind of take that burden off of people, make sure that they understood that they were going to have representation, and that we were going to start taking shots at some of the biggest offenders of constitutional rights, places like the Louisiana State Police, Jefferson Parish Sheriff's Office, St. Tammany Parish Sheriff's Office, those kind of folks who we know have been historically involved in a lot of police misconduct. But I want to point out that unconstitutional policing is just one contributing factor. So prosecutorial discretion is also a huge piece in terms of how sentencing happens. So as you know, police charge, but the district attorney has the discretion on whether they accept the charges as they are, they reduce the charges, or they increase charges. So prosecutorial discussion is paramount in how decisions get made, and that really carries through into sentencing as well. Draconian sentencing. We had some of the longest sentences in the world in Louisiana, far higher than our southern counterparts, and those are some of the things that we've kind of worked on over the years to address. But now that we have a Republican governor, we have a Republican attorney general, we have a hypermajority of Republicans in the legislature who have all just, identified that they want to roll back all of the criminal legal reform, we're probably going to be looking at the reinstitutional of a lot of those longer sentences, which is a huge barrier. One part of the system that I don't think people think about enough is the system of legal financial obligations, or LFOs. So these are fines and fees. People on probation and parole pay supervision fees. There may be restitution fees to pay, even when businesses may have already recovered through insurance. I have a colleague who's formerly incarcerated who had a restitution of $100,000 that she was required to pay for a business that had already recovered their insurance for the damage to the property, but she maintained having to pay restitution and be on supervision for that for at least 15 years. Those are, again, we're not talking about guilt or innocence here, we're talking about wealth and your ability to be able to pay. And then barriers to reentry. One of the big things that we worked on in 2017 with the justice reinvestment reforms was just simply allowing people to get occupational licenses once they were returning. You couldn't actually be a florist here if you had a criminal conviction. You couldn't be a barber. You couldn't. There were many different things that you just didn't have access to the occupational license because that's just the way we'd always done it. And so changing a lot of those things was really important. And we've actually made those changes, and hopefully we can stay with those. So Justice Lab is our intensive litigation and storytelling effort created at the ACLU of Louisiana in partnership with law firms and challenging racially discriminatory policing practices. Justice Lab cases show that Black people are policed for their everyday activities. As you might imagine, we have clients, and you'll see a little bit of a story from one of our clients, Mr. Monroe. He was targeted while driving home from work. We have a mother in St. Tammany Parish who was targeted and beaten at her home for suspicion of operating a motorcycle without a proper helmet, which she actually wasn't riding the motorcycle at the time, but a neighbor had reported that she was riding the motorcycle in the neighborhood without a helmet. Performing their work duties, we have folks who have been targeted on their jobs. We actually even have a family. There was a young African-American boy who was looking for a lost dog with his friends in the wrong community, and they were accosted by police and attacked. So we've seen just about everything that you can imagine. And what our cases show is that this is not a situation of bad apples or aberrations or things that are happening that, they're just these bad folks. This is a systemic issue, and it is prevalent and has been going on for decades, and there is no shortage of everyday injustice that goes along with simply being a person of color in the state of Louisiana, and I would argue in this country. So hopefully I'll be able to play this for you. This is Mr. Monroe, our client.
It was the day after Thanksgiving. I worked that night, from 8 o'clock at night to 4 o'clock in the morning. I love working that shift because I miss all the traffic going to work. And when I got off at 4 o'clock in the morning, it's so quiet you can hear a pin drop. I looked to my left, I saw the Louisiana State Trooper. He turned his lights on. I knew that if I get out this car, this man is gonna do something to hurt me. I can feel it. In the back of my mind, I'm knowing that he running my license plate, seeing that I've done nothing wrong. So I'm trying to find my lawyer's number to call him, and then I call my mother instead by accident. And I hate today that I had to call her, because she was not ready to hear that. My mother said, "Baby, please don't do nothing to make this man a reason to shoot you." And when I stepped out of my vehicle, that's when the process started. He grabbed both of my hands, pulling me toward him, made it look like I was resisting arrest. Another trooper showed up. They threw me on the ground, jumping on my back, pounding on me with my hands behind my back. And they just pressing down, and I'm screaming, "Oh my God, I can't breathe." And I'm like, this is not supposed to be happening to me. I haven't done anything wrong.
This is really just an example of the everyday indignities that people of color face at the hands of police, period. We want something better for our children and for their children, just like our ancestors wanted better for us. The ACLU Justice Lab is a systemic, comprehensive approach to addressing police violence. So we want to hold them accountable and the departments that employ them so that they can change their policy and conduct. We have filed in 3 years, 50 cases in every federal jurisdiction in Louisiana. Victims of police violence do not have representation, and that's one of the most important, beautiful aspects of this program. When they open the courthouse door, they deserve to have a fair shot at having an opportunity to protect their rights.
The law should be blind, but it's not. You shouldn't have freedom to abuse people like that in the United States, no matter where you live at.
People deserve to live free of violence, and in particular, police violence. We want to stop the kind of harmful and dangerous police stops and interactions that occur far too frequently. We want to change some of the structural legal impediments or things that prevent you from bringing your case in court. The ACLU is the chief defender of civil rights and constitutional liberties for all people. We fight in the courts, we fight in the legislature and in community. And in Louisiana, that means for us that we stand up for those who are most marginalized.
And we all have rights to live and let others live. And we should be able to live in peace every day. Not just one day, but every day for the rest of our lives.
Yeah. So Mr. Monroe's story, I'm sure there were certain aspects of it that were very triggering, is not unique. It's not unique in this city. It's not unique in this state. It's not unique in this country. And it's something that happens far too frequently to people of color, but also, as I said, to women, to the LGBTQ community, to young people. And, one thing that kind of makes me a little disheartened is that when we created this video, there was so much support nationally, right after George Floyd. Everybody wanted to address this question of police violence. And so that's specifically why we decided to make a decades-long commitment to doing this work, because we understand that there's no way that you can change the history of policing, which has obviously created the current system of policing that we have today. You can't change that in a year or 2 years. But as you probably know, support for police accountability has largely completely changed. We are now in an era where there was a time where Black Lives Matter had a very low approval rating, almost 20 or 30%. At the time of George Floyd, it went up to something like 70 or 80%. I would imagine the polls would probably reflect now that it's back to where it was before, if not worse, probably in light of what happened with the defund the police movement and all of that kind of controversy. And so you might be surprised, but we had a lot of support for this program when we first initiated it. A lot of support with law firm partners, a lot of foundation support. Our law firm partners are fantastic, and we've built relationships with them over the last 3 years. We have a lot of dedicated partners who really believe in the work that we're doing. But the support by way of foundations has really dried up. People are just not as concerned about this issue, and likely won't be concerned until there's another national issue that comes up in the news where we can all pretend that, wow, this is shocking and this is awful. But I really want to take this opportunity to say to all of you folks and journalists in the room, I really think you all are probably one of the most important, I think, linchpins in bringing some form of fairness and equality into the criminal legal system. And I say that because I think about the story of Ronald Greene. Are you all familiar with the Ronald Greene story? It became a national story. The family had been talking about the injustice that happened to them for some time, but as you likely know, the reason that that story became a national news story is because of the work of journalists. The Associated Press was able to leak the video documenting the abuse and murder of Ronald Greene. And so, I think about the kind of courage that it takes, the kind of commitment that it takes to do that kind of work. And I think about you all, and I think about the choices that we have in our everyday lives to take the kinds of risks that help change the course of history. And each and every one of us have that opportunity to do those kinds of things. And I want to also kind of turn it and flip it back on us in the activist community and us as citizens as well. A lot of times it's just easier to say, I don't actually want to be on record as saying this particular piece of information. And I always question myself when I do that, because I'm thinking about whose interests am I trying to protect? Am I aligning myself with the power structure, or am I actually aligning myself with people, largely who don't have power and who need someone who's in a position like I am, even if it may not be an incredibly powerful position, I still have a platform. And so thinking about the platforms that you have in that way every single time, because we make all kinds of little, I don't know, I guess I'd call them baby decisions. And sometimes they're even we're not even really conscious of them, where we're using our platform in a way that continues to support power, as opposed to thinking about the ways of shifting that power dynamic with our ability and the platforms that we hold. So I just want to offer that to you, and I think about you all as really powerful in that way. And sometimes, we all feel like we all have bosses, we all have higher-ups, we all have deadlines, we all have responsibilities, but we're also each inherently deeply powerful in the decisions that we can make and the way that we advocate. And so I'd like to offer that invitation to you to always kind of remember the power that you hold. So the importance of data. Largely when you hear that police violence is an issue of bad apples or bad actors, those are typically anecdotal arguments. And so what we've tried to do with our Justice Lab campaign is to actually document actual violations of rights with our individual cases. And now we're compiling a really amazing dashboard and database that's actually going to do that really beautifully. And it will be hopefully a wonderful resource to journalists, community members, researchers, and others that really want to be able to tell this story with not just anecdote, but with evidence. So our dashboard goes live on January 29th. You're welcome to join. We're doing a little webinar. It'll be on our website as well, but what it's largely going to do is we've culled all of the folks who we've sued, police officers, agencies, and we have identified, to the extent possible for the agencies that have reported, all of the misconduct that the individual officers that we have sued have been involved in across their careers, and have put that into the database in a way that is searchable by officer, by agency. And we also have some other trends as well on there that are particularly helpful. So I don't think folks will be very happy with us, but hey, we're the ACLU, that's okay. We're used to that. So I just want to leave you with some really great recommendations. So I don't necessarily think in your particular communities that you have to necessarily be like allied with the ACLU. Sometimes folks are thinking like, okay, you know, I know you have a responsibility to report the news and to do it in an impartial way, right? So you don't necessarily have to be affiliated with the ACLU or other activists or nonprofit organizations. But what I will tell you is if you want research and you want to be able to present an alternative perspective, you do need relationships with the folks who are actually working in these spaces. And you need to be able to at least reach out and have those relationships to be able to understand the background on the issues that you're presenting on. And ACLU across the country is a really fantastic organization to do that, because we work across all civil rights, civil liberties issues, and so we're a wealth of resource on things across the board, from voting rights, reproductive liberty, criminal legal reform, immigration, First Amendment, privacy, security, all of those kinds of things. So check in with your local ACLU to kind of get more information there. Particularly with regard to crime, I mean, you probably all know this and probably have these resources, but the Sentencing Project does some phenomenal work, and they've got really amazing reports and really great resources. I rely on them a lot for information. I talked to you about the Pretrial Justice Institute, that report. They do a lot of really phenomenal work. And then also just some like personal readings for you all. If you haven't had a chance to read Michelle Alexander, you definitely should. If you're reporting on crime in the criminal legal system, you need an understanding, I think, of at least, you know, some of these works, so that you have the appropriate vernacular, you have the appropriate research, you have the appropriate history to kind of help ground, you know, some of your reporting. These are some of my favorite authors, some of my favorite organizations that I really kind of look to. And then, you know, honestly, I think the challenge that we're all facing right now is, there's a really great book that I love. It's called The End of Democracy. And as you know, the attacks on the press are very much a part of authoritarian ideology, fascist ideology of, you know, how do you actually get to the institutions that mean the most in the world, and how do you impact them so that they can actually impact society? And so it feels to me like institutions like the courts and the press are places that we're going to have to safeguard even more than ever. And when I say institutions, I mean you are the people. Literally, like, who are the we the people? You are the people that we have to protect. You are the people that we have to empower. You are the folks that are going to have to stand up against tremendous political pressure, tremendous, I think, all kinds of pressures, we'll say that. And at the end of the day, you're going to have to decide not whether something is political, not whether something is popular, not whether something is even economic, but whether it is right. And so I will leave you with that I really do feel like you all are kind of superheroes in a way. And I hope that when you take on your next assignment, if it is involved in reporting about the criminal legal system, that you literally think of yourself in that way, with your cape. And what good can you do? And what co-conspirators can you get involved with in order to help you do it? And if you feel like you need some support from the ACLU, I'm your girl. So I'm happy to take questions. Yes, we have questions. We have questions. Yes, ma'am. How did I do on time? Good. We're going to have a big, robust discussion. Anybody want to come up here and sit on the couch with me? It's all here.
I'm Carly Luca. I'm in Alexandria, Louisiana.
Oh, awesome.
Yes. So one thing that you touched on a little bit is sort of the pipeline of putting Black Americans into the prison system, but we didn't really delve much into incarcerated workers. I think in Louisiana it's like 40 cents an hour at most that you would get paid as an incarcerated worker.
Yeah.
What kind of work has the ACLU done on that topic, and what kind of resources for us are there if we wanted to delve into that?
Oh, she just gave me a softball. She just tossed it right up there. Well, we put out a report with our national office last year called Captive Labor. You can Google it, it's available, and it's pretty shocking. So there are probably, let's see, I think what you're talking about in terms of the rate of return for work is even less than what you suggest. So most people start out at Angola, our state penitentiary, making 2 cents an hour, working in the fields. So the irony of that is that Angola obviously is a former plantation, and the descendants of the people who are currently incarcerated in Angola were enslaved in Angola and doing the exact same work for no pay. And so I think about Brian Stevenson when he talks about kind of juxtaposing our system of incarceration here in the United States with what happened in Germany, Nazi Germany, and to think about if Germany were now currently incarcerating Jewish people in the same way that we continue to incarcerate black people, with the history that Germany has, how it would be completely reprehensible, not possible, because it would clearly, we would know our own history and we would know that we were repeating it. And essentially, that is exactly what we're doing. Most incarcerated people are not paid for their work. And the only difference between incarcerated labor and regular labor is that there are no protections for actual people's safety, and they're not paid. So if you live or work here in the state of Louisiana, I was actually at the legislature yesterday, all of the staff at the Louisiana legislature are incarcerated people. The people who perform the groundskeeping, the people who prepare the food, the people who clean the office building, the people who work in the governor's mansion. The only difference is they're not paid for their work, or they're paid pennies on the dollar. That is actually across the nation, though. The folks who fight fires in California, who are the frontline folks who are doing that work, incarcerated people. Lots of people who are doing a lot of services that we might imagine would be paid labor by people who are not incarcerated. That's actually not true. And so, yes, there are resources. I think our report profiles 3 states. I think California and Illinois are the other ones, but captive labor, I think you should definitely take a look at it. And it really helps to undergird this idea of incarcerated labor really being a driver of economic opportunity for our state. And so when you're thinking about it for the pecuniary and the financial impacts that it has, and largely that the prison industrial complex largely exists so that the economy can continue to exist and people can continue to have jobs, then it kind of helps you be a little bit more clear about why we have to continue to incarcerate at the levels that we do. Thank you.
Okay. Emily Goodell, Apple Valley News Now in Yakima, Washington. I had a question about the pretrial incarceration. So we have a problem at our local jail where people are waiting months and months, if not years on years, trying to wait for trial, and they're in the jail itself. And so a lot of them end up taking plea deals to get a year and a day or more, just so that they can get out of county jail. So I'm curious, when you were doing that type of investigative work, what were the records that you were requesting for that?
Yeah. So we were requesting information around what people were incarcerated for. We were really trying to get at length of stay. So and it was actually a really difficult thing to get at. And that's how we got to that 5.5 month number, which was pretty shocking. We wanted to investigate bail, because clearly, when you're talking about pretrial incarceration, you're going to be talking about, if you really want to get to the heart of the problem, a bail reform conversation. Because if you're not able to address the fact that excessive bail largely drives the issue, that would be a challenge. What else were we looking at? Length of stay, obviously demographics, we're looking at racial disparity there. And then some of the reform efforts that we were thinking about, I mentioned that we were looking at this issue of institution of charges for the DAs. Looking at the time folks have to institute charges is a big deal, because if you have to, so the interesting or neat thing about the way that prosecutorial discretion functions is a lot of times in New Orleans, Code of Civil Procedure 701 was the kind of the law that we had to be thinking about. But we were looking at, when we were charging someone, what's their 701 release date? We have to know what decision we make, or else that person is released to go home. And so if that 701 release date is 30 days out, 60 days out, and you know that you're making essentially bail recommendations, which the district attorneys make, and largely judges accept whatever the bail recommendation is that the district attorneys make, then you know that largely you're just kind of trying to bide as much time as you can. And so that was one of the recommendations that we made. And honestly, like starting to look at, I think, things like predictive policing and over-policing of certain communities is something that's really important too, because I mean, we have a lot of issues with that in New Orleans. Like we have a real-time crime center. We now have thousands of cameras that are on businesses, homes, and other properties that feed into the real-time crime center. So what it was supposed to be was not predictive, but rather that these cameras were going to help on the back end, like solve crime, catch people doing crime. But now what it really looks more like is folks who have the opportunity to observe on the front end whether people are doing things that look suspicious, whether they should be in this neighborhood or not, and then deploying officers and others into certain communities based on things like that. And so that's really important information to think about as well. How do people actually get into the front door? Usually it's through police.
Hi, I'm Kat Stromquist from Gulf States Newsroom. We're public radio in Louisiana, Mississippi, and
I've made my
Alabama.
donations, NPR.
That's
Love
all
y'all.
right. Thank you for
I
that.
feel smarter after I spend time with y'all.
We haven't met, but your staff has actually been really helpful to me, so thank you so
good.
much for that.
I'm so glad.
I wanted to ask you, thinking about that relationship between advocates and reporters.
Yeah.
You know, when you're, as an advocate, you're looking through news coverage.
Yeah.
What are you looking for in stories that show you that a reporter is committed to race-conscious coverage? Are you looking for historical context? Are you looking for diversity of sources? You know, what shows you that, like, this person gets it? I would love to know more about that.
Oh, yeah, that's a really good question, Catherine. I think the two things that you brought up are really great. I think I kind of pointed to it a little bit in the presentation. Without the proper historical context, like if you're reporting about Jefferson Parish Sheriff's Office and you're not reporting about the extreme and extensive history of racist policing leaders in that community that have identified race as the predominant factor that they use in terms of like the way in which they police, if you're not actually providing that kind of background and perspective, I think it's particularly harmful. Absolutely a diversity of sources. So here's the thing. I want to just like, I'm not going to send just all the invitations for you all to like be perfect out. I think we also have to turn the lens on advocates. We always want things the way we want them too, right? We want you to we want you to tell the story exactly the way we said it, and we want you to put the spin on it that we want on it, because we're trying to convince and galvanize the public and a population. And so I absolutely do love when there are a diversity of sources. And I really do feel like I'm actually happy for folks to get a full picture, because largely I think they've only gotten one picture. And so that actually feels really, really great to me. I also love when I actually am able to establish a relationship with a journalist, because then I think you're able to get to know our work with a greater depth. And this is something that I try to explain to my staff all the time. So much is developed in relationship, and it's hard to say what benefits always come out of that, but I absolutely know that deep relationships with the communities that you're reporting on improves your reporting, always. And deep relationships with the folks that you're interacting with also improves your reporting. And so I really stress that, the idea of not necessarily just coming to someone as a one-off, but absolutely kind of going back and developing those relationships. I feel like that kind of creates a better opportunity for really in-depth reporting.
Ashley Hamilton with WGNO. I actually spoke to you once abortion was banned. Love the interview.
Hey, Ashley.
I want to start off looking at your numbers and everything. We have a new governor coming in who ran on being tough on crime. We're about to have a special session based on just crime. Yep. Where do you see Louisiana in the next 4 years, do you see those numbers actually increasing more? And how is your office ready to face this new tough on crime that our new governor is bringing to the forefront, seems like it?
Yes. Are we on the record or off the record? No, I'm kidding. I'm just kidding. So I was at the legislature yesterday. We've been doing some planning about the special session. I think one of the most important things that you all could know, and this feels crazy because even when I hear it, I'm like, that can't be real. Crime in the last 5 years has actually gone down in Louisiana, and incarceration has actually gone down. I know it doesn't feel like that, and that's the crazy thing about like the criminal legal system and all the fear and all the like terror that gets baked into it. And also some of our own personal experiences, right? If your car has been broken into recently, you don't feel safe. You feel like shit is going down, excuse my language, right? You do. I've had my car broken into in my driveway, and so I'm like, you feel violated. But at the same time, we actually have to that's why we kind of talked about like anecdote and personal experience and kind of, yes, I think we can absolutely have our experience and our experience should be validated, but the statistics actually show something very different. Now, is there an uptick in violent crime since the pandemic? Yes, there is. One of the things that I think is the most important thing that you all could know about the work that we did in 2017 with Justice Reinvestment is that we saved the first year by the work that we did with regard to reducing sentences, adjusting some things with community supervision, and working on reentry. We saved about $12 million. The beautiful thing about Justice Reinvestment is that 70% of that money was earmarked to be reinvested back into the community for programming and services, community-based services that actually support folks who have substance use disorder, mental health conditions, and other things that we know drive crime. What happens when you start to reincarcerate people? So let's think about the services that are actually funded by the money that you save when you stop incarcerating people. The United Way gets a lot of that funding. The Crime Victim Survivors Fund is one of those big places that gets services and gets money from this work. So I think the story that we need to be talking about is the fact that crime is actually down, and when you're not incarcerating people, the best way to work on incarceration or an issue of crime is to actually go to the underlying sources. So poverty, lack of opportunity, lack of connection to school and job. I mean, those are the things. And then addressing mental health and substance use. 40% of people incarcerated either have a mental health condition or a substance use disorder or something co-occurring. Getting to those things have to be invested in. We have to have money to do that. And so largely where we're going to be focused, I'll tell you where I think the crime session is going to go. I think we're going to be looking at longer, more draconian sentences through things like mandatory minimums, right? There is a lot of research around the harm of mandatory minimums, and largely what that means is that judges don't have any discretion to be able to think about the individual circumstances of a case. If you do this one thing, you get this sentence, and that's it. There's also going to be an effort to undo the decades-long work that we did around raising the age of when a young person can be treated as an adult, bringing that back down to 16. There's lots of research about the harms in that. We're working in coalition with the Southern Poverty Law Center, Promise of Justice Initiative, Operation Restoration, lots of other nonprofits to prepare. This is a new environment. We are largely, the legislature and the governor can do what they want without the influence of Democratic support, and so it's going to be a very interesting time. I would imagine we're going to be in court, probably federal court, very often. We're preparing for that. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a scary time. It really is. But what I do know is that the tough on crime rhetoric and what is being posited as the way to help keep us safe has never kept us safe. And the work that we did to actually undo some of that work has been effective. And if we can continue to tell that story as much as possible, I think that would be really powerful, because we are up against, I think, a tide of tough on crime and fear-based narrative that I think will take us back many, many decades.
We have time for one more question right here.
Hi, I'm from the NPR station in Kansas City, so thanks for your donation.
Oh,
we
go, I'm
appreciate
so
that.
happy.
Yeah. So after George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement, and it felt like there was so much momentum for police reform.
Yeah.
Or perhaps it was just rhetoric, because I don't know that I have seen that a lot on the local or regional levels. And I don't know that there's even an appetite for it anymore. Like, the protesters that were out there have all gone home.
Yeah.
And they rarely come out now. So do you think that's done? Do you think police reform era, if it ever did come to be, is that gone too? What do you think about, and that's just sort of like a national, open-ended question.
No, I don't think it's done. I think, so one of the things that one of my mentors shared with me is that when you are doing this kind of work centered around civil rights and civil liberties, it's a pendulum. And the pendulum always swings forward, and you have that momentum, and God knows it could take decades and decades to swing it forward, and there are lots of very dedicated people pushing it forward, but then it swings back. And so in some ways, instead of being kind of resigned to the fact that like people don't care, I do think of it as a pendulum, and I think of certain unfortunate experiences or things that happen as potential ways to swing it back and forth. I think we're going to experience a lot if we are in fact to see another administration of Donald Trump, of many, many harms that are violations of people's civil and constitutional rights. And what we know, though, that happens when those kinds of things happen is like people get galvanized and people care again. Like, people invested in the ACLU tenfold when the Muslim ban happened and when Trump was elected. Obviously, that's not what we want. But I don't know. I don't think it's done. I think there's still a huge opportunity. I think there is still the opportunity to pass the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. We're actually doing federal advocacy to change the statute of limitations so that we can continue to prosecute cases here in the state of Louisiana. I mean, we're dedicated to it. But I largely think, when I think about the fact that 95% of prosecutors elected in this state alone, and sheriffs, actually I think it's 98%, are white men, older white men. Sometimes I think we're looking at the back end of the problem, but we're not necessarily looking at the front end. I think we've all heard about why it's important to have diversity in almost every single aspect of our society. It's part of the kind of the reason why I don't feel too terrible about the fact that I used to be a prosecutor, is that we need more people with diverse backgrounds, with diverse experiences, with connections to different communities, in positions in law enforcement and in the criminal legal system, and as prosecutors and as judges and as police officers and police chiefs and all of these things, so that we can start to make some different decisions. And perhaps there's an opportunity for us, perhaps maybe not in the next 4 years, but maybe in the next 8 years or beyond, to kind of see that pendulum swing forward again. I'm gonna leave y'all with a message of hope. Bye, thank you so much.